Hey, this is Andy.
And Randy.
And we're here on AT Corner.
Being an athletic trainer comes with ups and downs, and we're here to showcase it all.
Join us as we share our world in sports medicine.
Welcome back to another episode of AT Corner. For this education episode, we are going to be talking about relative energy deficiency in sport and the female athlete triad.
So essentially, this is every athlete who you've had who doesn't eat enough.
Yes, and then what exactly happens to them by not eating enough. And sneak peek, there's a lot that happens when you don't eat enough.
I wonder why.
Yeah, right? It's almost like fuel for your body is very important.
Gas for your car.
I do use that analogy a lot, especially the athletes love it when I say, now imagine you're a Ferrari.
Just imagine.
Yeah, they love that.
So this episode is eligible for CEUs. So if you are interested in BOC CEUs, you can scroll down to the show notes. This episode, if you're listening to it as it comes out, it is free. If it is within our last 3 episodes, it's going to be $1. And anything beyond that, it is still affordably priced. Thanks to Mass General Brigham. You can look in the show notes below for the course evaluation and the quiz.
So the goals of this episode are we're going to discuss the etiology of relative energy deficiency in sport. We will probably use the acronym RED-S or REDS. I've always heard it as REDS, but some people...
I know it as RED-S.
Yeah, so we're talking about relative energy deficiency and the female athlete triad. We're going to discuss the evaluation and treatment of a patient that you suspect of having REDS or female athlete triad. And then we're going to describe the return to play process after a diagnosis of REDS or female athlete triad.
So essentially, you've probably had this before. You probably just didn't have a name for it.
Yeah, I'd say so. For sure. I think it would be, you've probably seen the signs of it without knowing, like, oh, this is the condition. This is the actual name for it.
So I'm excited to see, like, what we can do for it and how we can loop in our other healthcare professionals in this team.
And as we get talking about this, that's going to be the most important thing, is this is definitely multidisciplinary, right? This is going to be coming from a lot of experts, to help kind of provide this patient-centered care. All right, so I know the first question everyone's thinking, what the hell is REDS and female athlete triad? All right, so REDS is essentially impaired physiological functioning caused by a relative energy deficiency, right? So you just don't have enough energy going into your body. The systems that are included but may not be limited to are metabolic rate impairments, menstrual function, bone health, immunity, protein synthesis, and even cardiovascular issues can pop up from having relative energy deficiency. That's why at the beginning I said everything gets affected, because literally everything is affected.
Oh, I mean, if you think about the macro and the micronutrients, all those things are what makes up all the body processes.
Yes, for sure.
So if you're not getting enough of those things, what do you expect to happen?
Exactly, right? For us to live, it takes energy, right? So now expanding on REDS, the female athlete triad, this is the relationship between low energy availability, menstrual function, and bone health. So the female athlete triad has been kind of studied for a long time now. It was kind of presented, I believe, in the early 90s when it was first like, hey, this is the term for what we're seeing, right? REDS is kind of a newer concept, but a lot of people kind of want to think like, oh, REDS is replacing the female athlete triad. Well, no, that's not necessarily true. The female athlete triad is a component of REDS. REDS is kind of like that umbrella term of, hey, here are all the issues with relative energy deficiency. The female athlete triad is a relationship between a few of those issues. So that's how I kind of got it when I was reading it and looking at how that continuum looks like. It's just kind of, the female athlete triad is a part of it. REDS is the big umbrella term. All right. So at the end of the day, if you haven't noticed from those definitions, it all boils down to just having low energy availability. This is essentially defined as insufficient energy intake and or excessive energy expenditure, resulting in a compensatory metabolic adaptations, right?
So what does that mean in real life?
So what that means is I'm not putting in enough food and or I'm exercising too much, right? Using too much energy.
Think about our sport athletes.
Yes. And what that leads to is your body has a choice, right? It's going to use its energy to like, hey, we got to perform this exercise, but it's going to start sacrificing some basic functions of life, right? So, right, there's only so much energy that can go around. Your body's going to have to make a decision. And obviously, when you're exercising, hey, that I need to perform this action because your body thinks, life or death, we got to keep moving, stuff like that, right? So it's going to essentially make a decision, and it's going to start sacrificing some of these basic functions that we need to live that do require energy.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a definition for what is termed low energy availability. Some of the literature is saying less than 30 calories per kilogram of fat-free mass per day.
And if you don't know how to find your mass in kilograms, it's just your weight in pounds for our US folks.
Yes.
Divided by 2.2.
Yes. But even this cutoff is not really it's not like a hard line, right? This kind of number came off of a lot of the early female athlete triad studies, and they were looking at sedentary women. So that number is just kind of a ballpark, right? It's going to give us an idea, right, of, hey, if you're around 30 or below, that's not a good area, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even if you're not having symptoms yet, it's still, hey, let's maybe get that up a little bit. And the one nice thing about energy availability, like measurements, is it's really hard clinically. So if you're stressing on man, how am I going to do this with my athletes? It's already really hard to do. There's other signs that we'll talk about that we can be able to kind of look at to kind of identify maybe low energy availability.
And this is where ideally we would all have registered dietitians, but that sounds like a dream world.
You know what? Ideally, yes. Definitely a dream world for some settings for sure. But that doesn't mean we can't work towards it for sure.
Right.
Okay. So now that we know what these terms mean and what the conditions are, let's talk about the actual consequences, right? We kind of talked about some of the systems that are involved, but here are some signs that we could see in those systems that indicate dysfunction or why this is such a problem. So for cardiovascular issues, you can see an early onset of atherosclerosis. There could be some arrhythmias, which is kind of the dangerous component when we start talking about low energy availability, disordered eating disorders. They could have valve abnormalities, and there's even some effects on iron deficiency.
Which I feel like is so easy, especially in the female athlete.
Oh, for sure.
I feel like you see that so often, so it makes sense that it would be a consequence of low eating anyway.
Oh, 100%. And what I thought was very fascinating is there was a little stuff on how iron is also important for bone development.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
That was pretty crazy. So that was kind of cool to kind of see just how interconnected all these systems are to their normal function. So I thought that was pretty cool. Immunological, like immunity can be affected, right? Literature has shown that those that have higher workloads or lower energy availability have had increased upper respiratory infections.
Oh, interesting.
I know, right? Well, there's not enough fuel for the white blood cells to do their deal, right? Gastrointestinal issues. They could have altered sphincter function. This could lead to delayed gastric emptying time, constipation, and the poo takes a little bit longer to go down the system, right? Increased transit time, right? Because basically your body's trying to suck out as much as it can because it needs, it's missing some energy, right? So it's going to need a little bit more.
Right. And without all that fiber.
Yeah, without that fiber, it's not going, it's going to move a little slow. And then obviously, right, the big one that we've been talking about, the relationship between the endocrine system, menstrual cycle, and then bone health, right? And this is exactly where that female athlete triad fits within this continuum, right? Is essentially that interplay of all those.
Well, what's really interesting and what I think about sometimes is how a low energy availability would have an effect on bone health. But on the other hand, you also think of resistance training and sports training as being helpful for bone health.
Yep.
But because of the of Wolff's law and everything about the reaction of the bone to the forces put upon it.
Yes.
But if you think about it, really negates all the positives of bone health that happen in sports.
Yeah.
If the body isn't available to build up that bone to the forces placed upon it.
Yeah, 100%. And that kind of goes back to what we talked about in one of our throwback episodes when we were talking about stress fractures.
Oh, yeah. That was a while ago.
Yeah, right? We kind of hinted at that where, yes, exercise is good, but there is a threshold because of the stress exercise does provide.
I always explain it to my students as the the osteoblasts and osteoclasts, like the osteobuilders, or the bone builders, and the bone, what do we call them? The crashers, or like the...
Ooh, I like that. Because of the C.
Right. So the it's like a house, and like you have to keep doing demolition on the house in order to build it up.
Yep.
Right? If you want a new window, you have to take out the existing window. Like if if a window's broken, you have to take that window out, and then you have to put it back in. But there are more of the crashers, or the more the demolition guys, or the osteoclasts, who are doing more work of that, rather than the osteobuilders to come in and actually put in new windows and build up that structure.
Speaking of house, we've learned a lot about that concept for sure.
Yes, we have.
About things have to be torn down to be built up sometimes.
Yes.
So back to what we're saying about like the bone health and the endocrine system, all that interplay there, right? So essentially, the idea is the low energy availability leads to an altered hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis and some other hormones.
That's a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot. So basically, some of the organ or locations in the brain that are in charge of releasing some hormones, there's a problem there, and it relates to the organs that produce hormones within like kind of the gonadal region, right? And some other hormones are affected, like growth hormone, right? Our body becomes less sensitive to it. Insulin, like growth factors, all that stuff. Basically, stuff for like development and stuff that are kind of important also to bone health are affected as well. So it's not just like one set of hormones. No, it's a disaster all over the place, basically. All right. So essentially what this leads to is estrogen, progesterone, all kind of decrease. And then the alterations in LH decrease as well, or it changes, right? It's not a normal rhythm of LH. So that could have a big issue too. That results in oligomenorrhea and or amenorrhea.
Can you define those real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. So oligomenorrhea is essentially your cycle is like just abnormal, and it can go in excess of 35 days. So if you have a patient that's kind of complaining of maybe some of these symptoms, right? And you're going to ask about the menstrual cycle.
But also about birth control, because...
Yeah, that could also have effect for sure.
And other factors can have an effect.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, I feel like that's pretty common.
Yeah, right. So, but essentially too, you're looking for that change, right? Like a sudden change from what maybe their normal would be. And then amenorrhea is actually divided into two. There's primary, which essentially menses fails to occur before the age of 16. And then kind of what we're looking for in that change aspect is that secondary amenorrhea, which is essentially less than 3 cycles per year or a lack of menstruation for 3 consecutive months. Just what you wanted in the morning, talking about menses.
What's wrong with talking about that in the morning?
I feel like you just weren't ready for it.
You know, I feel like we talk about this a lot in like gymnastics.
Yes, yeah.
But I also feel like just in general in other sports, that's just like you are working your body very hard.
100%. We like, again, like you were saying, like we talk about this a lot in gymnastics. Like we definitely talk about this with our runners, right? Like this was kind of a big thing that I've had to kind of look at, especially when we were doing medical histories, right? The different questions about how old were they when they, started their menstrual cycle, or the time period of how many cycles they have, and like stuff like that, right? Like that was actually very important for someone like me working in like track and field, cross country, because that's a big deal. And that's what a lot of literature says. If it's a sport that has weight class or kind of like has this drive for like thinness, or like the view that, or like an aesthetic sport, right? They have a higher risk of running into these issues. So basically, the decreases in these hormones leading to those signs of menstrual disturbances eventually lead to a degradation of the bone, right? Estrogen is a huge regulator on bone health, and growth hormone does also play a role because it is a very important hormone to our development as well. Also, with the decrease in hormones in women, these hormones actually increase the rate of bone absorption as well. So not only do they kind of turn off that bone building aspect, they also put into overdrive hey, let's tear down some bone while we're at it,
Take out all the windows, don't put them back.
Exactly. Now, the question that's kind of come in the literature the last few years, and it's been hinted in some of the older literature on female athlete triad, is, does this happen in males? Right? If we don't have enough, as a male, if we don't have enough energy, do we kind of see those same effects on our hormones as well? And essentially, the idea is the same as the female athletes. Right, so they actually coined the term the male athlete triad,
which is so fascinating. I feel like we don't ever talk about that.
I literally, until I started doing this reading, I never heard of that. Like, that was wild. I thought it was kind of interesting to kind of hear that it could still happen in males, just in a different fashion.
Right. I feel like the same. We talk about like the incidence of eating disorders in women compared to men, and the incidence of like bone osteoporosis in women compared to men.
Yes. So, and we're gonna get into a little bit of that too as we talk about like the male athlete triad, right? So this low energy availability again leads to that altered hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis stuff, right? Basically the hormone centers in the brain and the gonads. This leads to a decrease in testosterone and also LH cycling as well. That gets altered. And this could have a negative impact on spermatogenesis, sperm function, and libido as well. All right, so you kind of see it like in that like important like sex organ functions, right? And like in females, a big sign of that is the menstrual cycle, and then in males, right, it's going to be more kind of like semen, libido, and all that stuff, right?
I feel like not as often do you have athletes come to you and they're like, oh man, like I really have a low sex drive.
Yeah.
Like I feel like those are things that would probably be found like if you send them,
yes.
if you refer them out.
Yeah. And also too, consideration like your setting, right? If you have minors, right, that's kind of an odd question to bring up. And like, yeah, no, for sure. So that's why I thought it was really interesting reading about this. Like, oh man, like that's a history question to think about, like if I'm truly concerned about it, but also like if I hear an athlete talk about it, right now that I can kind of hone in on like, oh wait, that's something's weird, right? So these alterations in hormones also leads to, again, poor bone health. But in men, it's quite interesting. It's a decrease in bone production, but their like bone resorption rates stay the same.
Wow.
Right? I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, seriously.
And I think a lot
of... They get to keep their windows.
Yes, they're just not building anymore. They're having the same rate of just getting rid of them, just they're not putting any new ones in. Also, another interesting thing in the male athlete triad is it takes a very big energy deficit to kind of induce these kind of changes in males. Right? They even went down to, again, that whole cutoff number, right? They went to like 15 calories per kilogram fat-free mass, right? Like they went really low.
Wonder if this, and this is not me like reading the research, this is just me speculating. I wonder if it has to do with the amount of storage in, like, let's say muscle of nutrients versus women's storage.
That's a good question. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, 100%. It could be for sure.
Because they're going to be having to get some energy from somewhere.
Yes.
And whether it has to be converted from, well, I mean, obviously glucose uses energy, or converted in the extreme from protein.
Yeah. No, 100%. And too, like, you know, some of those other factors, like calcium and stuff like that, right? That's stored in bone, right? When your body needs more, it's going to break it down. So how does that play a role?
Except that males don't have an increased reabsorption rate of...
I know, right? So then the question leads, why do women?
Because... I don't know. They would have more. I don't know.
I think it might lie with like the estrogen, the effects of estrogen, because like obviously men don't have a high level of it, whereas
most of the time,
most of the time, right? Obviously, there's gonna be fluctuations, but women tend to have a higher level of estrogen, so maybe a change there, like has such a huge effect. Whereas in men, like the level of testosterone, like testosterone's not like huge with like bone health, to my knowledge. If there's any endocrinologists out there who could correct that, that'd be fantastic. But yeah, I guess that's kind of where I'm thinking. Maybe
upon speculation.
Yes, upon our thinking. All right, so we talked about what happens with these conditions, right? What's affected? Why is it affected? Now let's talk about what we are looking for and what we can do, the evaluation and the treatment aspect of it. and as athletic trainers, right, we're part of the treatment team. But again, the whole treatment, there's a lot of different players in how we treat the female athlete triad and REDS. Right. So essentially, right, you want to take a good history, right? As with most conditions, especially when we're talking about kind of general medical stuff, right? A good history is going to give you a lot of information, right? So asking about those gastrointestinal issues, all right, cardiovascular issues, even those that, hey, that awkward question about menstrual cycle, or even now apparently with like the male athlete, maybe going into some of that like libido stuff and stuff like that, right? Again, it goes off of your setting too, right? So kind of what that comfort level is and like what's okay, what's not okay.
Right.
Again, like we talked about before, the energy intake part is very difficult to measure, right? Even in a lab, like it's like there's so much they have to control. So
energy intake as in like caloric intake?
Yeah. Like basically like keeping track of how much they're intaking, how much they're expending, right? I read on like some limitations on, well, self-report sometimes really hard.
Well, it can be also if things are not labeled, but also you have to be careful about mental health and self tracking.
Yes, for sure. Right, that's been a big topic. And you know what? The again, I'm pretty nerdy. So the podcast for the British Journal of Sports Medicine actually did a few episodes on like REDS and also like calculating body composition and like when to do it, who should do it. So those are all great listens. And again, it goes into that mental health aspect of maybe we should start shifting away from the weight stuff. And they brought up the fact that focusing on energy availability is a lot better than focusing on weight or like stuff like that. So definitely something to look at. For us as clinicians, one, good thing to kind of look at as far as like on your physicals or maybe like on your initial evaluation is kind of identifying that BMI if it's under 18.5.
Which usually BMI is not helpful for athletes because it doesn't take into consideration the body composition. But that's when we're looking at a high BMI. Like athletes usually have a high BMI.
Yeah, they're usually labeled as obese.
So and that's obviously not correct. So, but if it's low, and you know that they probably have a higher fat-free mass, then or more lean muscle tissue, then it's probably more problematic if their number is actually low as an athlete.
100%. And again, it's not that we're focusing on that number. It's more, hey, that's a good quick indicator of, okay, this person, something's wrong. Why we shouldn't be this low. Right. And again, you're going to also, like, if you're seeing this and you're worried about that energy intake, you're going to start looking for the signs of maybe disordered eating or eating disorders, right? So any signs of anorexia or bulimia. There are some really good questionnaires such as the SCOFF. I can't remember what it's broken down into, but I've used it in the past. It's just a quick questionnaire to kind of screen if someone could be at risk of disordered eating, right? Because that's the big concern we're talking about this. Like you can have all these like REDS and female athlete triad without disordered eating or an eating disorder, or it can also be associated with it, right? So that's one of those things like, hey, we need to rule out because that's going to determine, okay, how many players are we going to get involved with the treatment plan?
Right.
Some other history things to bring up is a history of stress fractures, right? If you have a student athlete that has had multiple stress fractures, okay, that's kind of concerning, right?
Right.
Why are your bones so susceptible to this overload injury, right? And sometimes this kind of goes into the type of stress fracture, right? I thought it was interesting. I was going into this, like lumbar or sacral stress fractures are predominantly influenced by hormonal factors, right? Like basically loading, like running and stuff, shouldn't necessarily load those that much to where they're getting stress fractures, like say a tibia or like the femur. So if they have like a history of maybe a sacral stress fracture or like lumbar stress fracture, obviously it does depend on the sport too, right? Repetitive extension leading to spondies, those are stress fractures.
Right.
All right. So that kind of depends. But like if you have a runner, right, and they're having like lumbar stress fractures, sacral stress fractures, right, that could be kind of a red flag. Like, okay, something more might be going on because there shouldn't be a lot of load going through there to stress the bone that much. And then again, right, with the female athlete, right, we're going to ask about menstrual function. And our history forms do a great job of asking those questions when they're coming in, so you have a good kind of idea where they are.
If they answer it.
If they answer it. All right, so asking, right, do they have amenorrhea or oligomenorrhea? So, right, getting an idea of their cycle. How's it changed from the past, or how's it been as of late, right? So kind of getting that idea, right? And same thing in men, right? Like if we're really concerned and, right, we're, if your setting kind of permits it and, you kind of are able to ask, right? Asking about that libido, right? Have they seen a decrease in sex drive? Or also some other indicators are decreased facial hair shaving. I didn't know that. I thought that was kind of interesting.
Shaving as in they don't need to shave as much?
Yeah, like they're not shaving as often as they used to, right? Because that's going to show that, something's going on with like possibly testosterone, right? Because they're not getting a lot of facial hair. So in some situations, there could be a lack of pubic hair. And then they've also considered maybe erectile dysfunction as well. Again, really got to understand your setting, like what kind of questions you can ask, right? But those are some signs that what could be going on in the male athlete triad.
Maybe that's why it's not talked about as much.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And again, too, it goes back to what we're talking about. Like, it takes extreme energy deficiency to sometimes even see some of these symptoms. So in athletics, that's kind of tough, but you never know.
Unicorn.
Yep, unicorn, right? All right, so we've done our evaluation. Now, what does the treatment look like, right? And as we've already said in this episode, right, the treatment team is multidisciplinary, right? Obviously, the team physician's kind of at that center of it, who's kind of running this process, right? But you're also going to use your dietitians, right?
Now, team physician, you would typically probably go through more of your family practice rather than your ortho for this.
Yes, you're going to want someone who's either probably sports med / internist, right? Who kind of understands more that kind of gen med aspect of it. Yeah, so great point there, right? That's why it is nice to make sure we always think of like orthopedic, right? But it is nice to have that resource for these kind of like gen med things. So they're kind of going to be the center of this, right? Again, this whole thing bases on energy availability, right? So the dietitian is going to be huge in this treatment plan, right? Because they are the ones who are actually able to prescribe those meal plans and like kind of go through that process. Whereas we're kind of like that support role, right? And then obviously if we're concerned about why we have this energy deficiency, whether it's disordered eating or an eating disorder, right? Mental health is probably going to play a role as well in understanding the symptoms there and the treatment plan there. So essentially what the idea behind that treatment is they're probably going to gear towards either increasing the energy intake, right? And they're probably going to do this gradual, right? They're not going to throw a lot.
Just eat a lot.
Yeah, right. That's
usually not going to fare very well for someone who's probably they're most likely not choosing to not eat as much.
Yes.
It's either a mental health thing or they aren't just available or don't realize they need that much.
For sure. Yeah, exactly. Sometimes they just don't know.
Right.
Like as an athlete that this is what I need to do.
When I was in college, when I was in undergrad, we did with a bunch of dancers, we looked at how much they were actually eating, and pretty much everyone was not getting enough energy for what.
Interesting.
Because, I mean, if you think about how many classes they have a day.
Yeah, like, true.
6 hours of dancing a day and you're not.
Barely having anything?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. All right. And plus another thing, like you said, like giving someone who hasn't been eating a lot, like, hey, go ahead and eat all this like in a short time period, right? It's not going to lead to a long-term success. That's not going to be sustainable.
Also, when you eat a lot of extra carbs, you tend to store water with them. So that extra water weight or like that feeling of bloatedness or the GI distress of just adding in extra food is just, there's so much more than just like, oh, let's add 500 calories a day. That sounds like just grab a Whopper or something.
Yeah. Well, and you know what? That's the nice thing about that is that's more the dietitian's domain, right?
Absolutely.
We are just there to support and like kind of help educate the athlete on why the dietitian's doing it this way and why it's important. But again, that is not our plan to make. That is coming from the dietitian.
Right.
Another consideration is going to be reducing the energy expenditure. Right. This could either mean, hey, modifying participation, or if symptoms are like bad enough and the athlete may be at risk of like, hey, there's like some dangerous things going on, right? Maybe just stopping sports participation as well, right? So it was very interesting kind of reading up on this is if they can keep you in your sport, they're going to try.
Absolutely.
But if there's any red flags or, hey, we're seeing like these issues, yeah, we're going to maybe either modify or just stop altogether. So the initial idea is, hey, maybe we increase the energy intake, see how we do if it's more kind of those minor symptoms. But as we get more severe, hey, we're probably going to have to take away that something in sport.
Right. I mean, you also know how you feel when you don't eat enough. I'm sure everyone's felt that.
Yes.
And so just imagine like a chronic sustaining of that. Yeah. Or sustaining is not even, you can't even sustain that.
Yeah. Just like you said, the chronic part, just
right.
repeatedly just being in that state.
Right.
And then, of course, our mental health professionals, right? That behavioral treatment, right? If we're looking at someone who may be at risk of an eating disorder or disordered eating, right? There's a lot to kind of dive into that and kind of work on that and trying to understand. Because a lot of times with disordered eating and eating disorders, there's more to it that developed that behavior, right? So it's going to take a lot to kind of unpack that and understand the root reason for that, right? So that, again, multidisciplinary team, right? And essentially, if these kind of like conservative, non-pharmacological treatments don't work, there are medications that can be prescribed. I didn't dive in a ton into that just because, again, it's not necessarily something, one, that I've really seen in practice, right? I see more kind of these conservative treatments. So I haven't seen a situation where it's like, this is kind of our last resort. We got to go medications. And plus I felt like, well, we don't really necessarily control that. So, but just know that is an option, right? If you have someone who is just not like, they're trying everything, they've done all the treatment, it's just not getting better. There are things that the physician can do to kind of like, okay, we tried this. Here are our next plans. Okay. So we've treated. Now we're thinking, how do we get back to play?
That's the thing is like, we have so many people in the sports medicine team who are being a part of this.
Yep.
And then now it comes back to us and we're like, okay,
what do we do? You know what? And that's the nice thing is return to play guided by that physician.
Yeah.
We appreciate that a lot. All right. But again, it's not like the physician's just making a unilateral decision, right? He or she or they is going to take all like the input from all parts of the medical team, right? If the dietitian's telling the team physician, hey, they're not ready, well, the team physician's not going to be like, get on out there, kid.
Hopefully not.
Yeah, hopefully not. All right, they're going to take all this input and be like, okay, all right, we'll make a decision as a team, right? And that's why it's very important that there's like efficient communication amongst all parts of the team about what's going on, especially to, again, the team physician, the one who's at the center of this treatment, right?
Right.
So essentially that return to play is going to just be really dependent on the risk to the athlete, right? We've talked about conditions or like situations where they might still be able to participate in sport, and then some where they might not be participating in sport, right? So the risk of the athlete's going to come into play. How many areas have been affected by the low energy availability, right? Because they're going to need that to be normalized, right, before they go out and play, or getting closer to normal, right? So lab should be normal, right? Their physical signs should starting to be normal, right? What I thought was interesting as well for male athletes, again, it takes a lot extreme energy deficits to create issues, but men recover a lot faster than women.
Again, I bet you it's because of that storage.
Yeah. Like they showed like even just like a week of just increasing that energy intake, they basically almost return fairly back to normal. That was crazy. I was like, wow. That's so interesting. But
which is also probably why we don't hear about it as much.
Yeah. Again, good point for sure. Right. They're going to like between the dietitian and the mental health professionals, right? They're going to try and make sure that, hey, diet and lifestyle changes, they're still doing them, right? They're not just going to go back to sports, stop, and then we're back into our like day one, here we go again, right? And then, of course, as with all injuries, right, return should be pretty gradual, right? Like, especially if you've been out, like if the athlete's been out a while, it's not going to be like, okay, well, hey, go hit that 40 miles a week again. All right, we're going to try and, build them up.
I mean, with anything.
Yeah,
coming back from concussion, coming back from just a typical
orthopedic
injury.
Stuff, yeah.
It's going to be gradual. It's their favorite part.
Oh, they love it. They love it so much.
So what's our action item, Randy?
Exercising and sport with low energy takes a toll literally on the entire body.
Yeah, that's a good wrap up.
Like, I know it's like, especially in like athletes, like obviously they don't know all this stuff, right? And they don't have, like, it's hard to tell, especially like if you're athletes like in our kind of like college, university settings, right? It's a young adult, right? And it's really hard for a young adult to necessarily think about the long-term effects of what happens, right? So it's really hard for them to appreciate, like, all this stuff can, like, if it progress, like, it can get dangerous. Like, you are at risk of a cardiac event or, you know, significant fractures or anything like that. So essentially, hey, deficits in energy affect the entire body. And if you are truly concerned or see any alterations, especially in those like kind of vital functions of life, especially again, like those sex organs and hormones, right? Those are very important to how we function as humans. If anything's different, any big changes, right? Use your referral system, use that healthcare team and go from there.
Right. So now if you're not dealing with this right now, this is the perfect time to explore what you would do and what your healthcare team is, who you're referring out to, kind of creating a plan for when you do run into this, because I feel like it's more common than we think.
100%.
And especially once you start to notice it, then you're going to be able to mitigate it a little bit more before it can get to that referral process. And I challenge you to go and figure out what food sources are available for these athletes too, because if they don't have food at home, which,
yes,
I mean, unless you're working in professional sports, I'm pretty sure you have come across an athlete who does not have food at home and has to rely on other sources. And no, that's not necessarily like the first thing that we think of, but it is part of our jobs as injury prevention, as mitigating. We have to make sure that, you know, the athletes are coming to practice prepared, or that they know where to go to come to practice prepared. Yes. And education about how to come to practice prepared. So, like, for example, something that I've done at my college is we have a food bank on campus. And so I always talk to my athletes about the food bank. I've also partnered with the food bank, so we're able to get some of their food sources into our athletic training clinic. So that, you know, we don't advertise it, because if someone needs something, we do send them over to the food bank. But worst case scenario, if someone doesn't eat today, I have something a little bit. And then when we make that connection, I can say, hey, this is from the food bank. This is where you need to go. Yeah. And here are the times, and here's where you need to go to get prepared for practice.
100%.
Because there are resources available. And even if it's not on campus, even if it's in the community, there are places available. Yes,
100%. And to your point too about like, hey, as athletic trainers, right, this is something like, even if you haven't seen yet, right, we got to keep in mind, because we are in such, especially in traditional settings, we are in such a unique position where we're probably the first healthcare provider they're going to talk to or have been exposed to, right? Some may have not even like seen their doctor or like been to their doctor in years, right? So a lot of times, hey, we're at the forefront of these kind of conditions, and
the doctor's not going to be able to get them food sources.
Yeah, for sure. Right. So we're definitely in that unique position where, hey, we're almost that first point of contact, and like, okay, where does this athlete need to go? What resources are available? Educating them on what's available, right? Because again, like you said, like their personal physician may not know, even like your team physician, right? Unless they're like fully up to date on like what's going on campus, they may not know about that food bank option that some campuses do have.
/ they might not even get to that in the time that they're meeting with the athlete.
100%, right? They're on such a time crunch sometimes, or, you know, hey, sometimes that it's hard to get into all these areas. And that's where, hey, being an AT is important.
Right.
But yeah, no, that was a good point, because again, yeah, a lot of times we're on that forefront, right? We're seeing these things first, and it's like, okay, where do we go from here?
Right. I mean, it also has an implication in if you have an athlete who you don't know that they're not eating enough.
Yeah.
But if they're starting to have some signs and symptoms, then you can kind of start to dig a little bit more or have some more history questions to kind of ask about. Like, hey, what did you eat today?
Yeah.
What kind of foods did you eat today? Because if you're having just simple sugars, those are going to be utilized very quickly. Whereas like a longer endurance sport is going to need more carbs. You're going to need protein. You're going to need fat. So basically just the getting a well-balanced diet
for sure
is something that, that might not be their focus. Oh, well, I had a hot dog and a hamburger before practice and a 32-ounce soda.
I should be good to go, right?
Yeah, that covers everything.
Yep. I've definitely seen LeBron do that before a game.
Yep. Oh, one last thing actually I do want to touch upon is that injured athletes, because we're dealing with injured athletes a lot.
Ooh.
Injured athletes actually need the same amount of caloric intake as they would if they were exercising regularly, because their body is increasing their metabolic rate to be a part of healing.
Ooh, good point. I didn't even think of that. And you know what? That kind of goes into what we talked about in a past episode with our interview with Emily.
Mm-hmm. So she's a registered dietitian. She works in sports. She's awesome. She has a great Instagram, injury_RD, I think it is.
Yes.
And I think it was episode 88. I think she just said that recently.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Dope.
Yeah, so check that episode out. She's awesome. And her Instagram, she's awesome. Yeah, and lastly, just dispelling that carbs are bad, because carbs are needed for exercise.
Yeah, for sure.
Especially before and actually after.
Yes, 100%. Those fab diets, man, you can't. That is not ideal for sport.
No. All right, how many references did you use for this?
This one we used about just under 10.
Okay, nice. So those references will be on our website, which again is in the show notes, where you can also find the course quiz and evaluation to get your CEUs. Every other episode, you guys, if you guys are new, every other episode is education or stories. This one was an education episode. Next week, we're going back to our stories. Our story episode, I don't know off the top of my head what it is, but you can go to our Facebook group, facebook.com/group/AT Corner Podcast. And at the top, I pinned all the upcoming story episodes, so you can kind of get an idea for what's upcoming. And on our Instagram, I post prompts of questions so that you can kind of get an idea and submit your stories. And lastly, it is a reporting year. We're still working with MedBridge, so you can get $150 off in a subscription for CEUs. It's worth a year.
Yes.
A year's worth of CEUs, which is great because not only can you use it for this year, but it transfers over into next year, so you can use it for next reporting
2
period
cycles
as well. So use code ATCorner again in the show notes for MedBridge, and that will get you $150 off. So, Randy, you got anything else to add?
Nope, that was perfect. Thank you for helping us showcase athlete training behind the tape. Bye.